you have enough light to take notes. The unity of life, and DNA is really the core that connects all the unity of life, although he didn't know that at the time. And the diversity of life, how everything's different, and the ways organisms are suited in life to their environments through adaptations. Never used the word evolution. He used the phrase descent with modification. It refused the view that all organisms are related through descent from an ancestor that lived in the remote past. That's what descent with modification means. And we talked about how it's like a tree. This is some of his free thinking about which groups might be related to which groups. And then I think we really were here. We told you that these are the two living relatives to the elephants. All right, Darwin noted that humans have modified other species by selecting and breeding individuals with desired traits, a process called artificial selection. This has been going on since BC time. People have been finding plants or animals that had characteristics that they benefit from and breeding them together and manipulating. Well, so that's artificial selection, which is what we do as human beings in manipulating animals, plants, and other organisms to get desired characteristics so that they can do something better for us, and that's called artificial selection. Proof of point. Look at this. Wild mustard is a wild plant, and in fact, I believe the goldenrod that you see, like a mustard family. Look at this. The agricultural experts have bred this plant. I say bred. Usually we say that with animals, but they have crossed plants with certain characteristics, and then actually kale, selecting for leaves, wanting the leaves of this plant, or at least some variation of this species, and that's kale. Now, if you select for these side buds, you get Brussels sprouts. That's how Brussels sprouts were generated, by selecting for that. I'm not saying that these vegetables come from the wild mustard. I'm saying that down through the years, different parts of this plant have been selected for and enhanced. And so we have the creation of new species of plants that serve different purposes. Cabbage, selection for the apical bud, which is the top, the end bud. And selection for flowers and stems. There's your broccoli that we all love, right? I just had some last night myself. Selection for stems. How do you pronounce that? Kohlrabi. I guess I'm not familiar with it. How many of you have ever eaten kohlrabi?
No.
But at least you know of it.
Well, I work at a fruit store, so yeah.
Oh, that's why you know it. Okay. Well, okay, so that's for the stems. And then these are just the illustrations. That's why a lot of these pictures are. It's important that you understand Mendel's observations and then his inferences that he made from his trip from the HMS Beagle, and then all the research afterwards. Observation number one, the big one. Members of a population often vary in their inherited traits. So you have to have genetic variation. Well, he didn't know genetic at the time, but you have to have variations. They have differing characteristics, I think, as illustrated by the ladybugs. You've got some ladybugs that have 2 spots. You've got more than that. Look at all these different variations. Just like the peppered moth story that we talked about. Observation number 2. All species can produce more offspring than the environment can support, and many of these offspring fail to survive and reproduce So in order for nature to have some left so that you don't have an extinct species, there's a tendency towards over-reproduction so that some will survive and reproduce. So those are the two big observations that he made. And here's an example of a fungal puffball. So it's a fungi, a puffball, and when it opens, it spews millions of spores out. And if they find a good location, a nice, warm, dark, moist location, they'll start doing good. But not all the spores will survive. So the inference from that is that individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a given environment tend to leave more offspring than other individuals. I know this is sounding like we're pounding this into your head, but this is a main concept of evolution. And the process by which this happens is through natural selection, most of the time. And if some inheritable traits are advantageous, individuals with those traits will produce more offspring that survive to reproduce, and this will increase the frequency of these traits in the next generation. Now, we all know from our study of meiosis, though, that just because you have an individual with a certain set of characteristics and they're mated with another individual with a certain set of characteristics, which processes, it shuffles the genes. Which cellular process creates the genetic variation, because there are different alleles present in the gene pool, which I wrote the word gene pool up there the other day and forgot to say much about it. But for instance, we can look at this population of Homo sapiens in this room right now, and for every locus of a gene, you have alleles, right? The contrasting. You have a chemical coding that will end up coding for a particular phenotype. If we put every allele of every person, of every chromosome and every gene in a big swimming pool, and that would be a gene pool of this population. And so unless there's a mutation that occurs within the germ cells, not makes you sex germ, but the sex cells, sperm and eggs, all you have available to you in terms of raw materials are those alleles in this gene pool. But remember, there are a lot of alleles that are recessive. So they're not necessarily expressed unless there is a homozygous situation of having two together, and then the phenotype for that pops up. So this is a gene pool concept, and the gene pool concept for populations is what evolution, natural selection, works on. But it doesn't mean that all the offspring of two individuals with desirable characteristics will have all kids looking just like them. For instance, how many of you look exactly like a combination of your parents? No. We're all, unless we're identical twins and there's still environmental influences, we're going to be different, internal and external, and many, many characteristics. In fact, there's a show I kind of want to watch. I think it's on CNN on Sunday night, 9 o'clock or so, that's on three identical twins. So they were triplets that evidently were separated at birth, didn't know each other, didn't even know they existed. And these men are now adults. And so I think it's going to be a kind of fascinating show to see how similar and how different they are in terms of behavior, in terms of likes and dislikes, and I think this is going to be fascinating. I don't work for CNN, I'm not, okay. I just happen to know that show is coming on Sunday night. So since you don't have to get up Monday morning to come to the class, somebody can watch it and tell us about it. And for some reason I miss it. This process increases the frequency of individuals with favorable adaptations and explains how organisms become increasingly well suited for life in their environment. Now what happens if their environment changes? Yeah, you're going to start changing the population frequency of alleles, because some now that might have been, just like with peppered moth, might have been selected for, which meant they lived, are not going to be selected against because of environmental changes. So, what are the key features of natural selection? You want to just look at those so I don't have to read all these to you? I don't like to read to people. Or you?
I want you to read.
You. How many people want me to read this to you? Whoops. Is this a democracy or not? Okay, so natural selection, certain individuals with certain characteristics tend to survive and they tend to reproduce more. It increases the frequency of these adaptations within the population. But if the environment changes, then natural selection may result in adaptation to these new conditions and may give rise to new species. So we have a topic, a chapter coming up, which is yours, isn't it? Was yours on new species? Origin of species, yes. And so, in fact, I really thank you immensely for getting this done. You're Terrence, right? Okay, Terrence is gonna, he was gracious enough to offer to do one of the first one, and that's a big deal. So I'm going to be sending it out to you through Blackboard. So good, I'll get it and review it. He's already sent it. So thank you again. Okay, these are just some examples we've seen of how the adaptations, how they're blending. We're looking at camouflaging and blending. You can hardly see these caterpillars on these different parts. Look at how they blend in. There are. Okay, this is a huge star. Now, if you've also got the outline out that I gave you for this chapter that I made for you, you're going to see how this all is listed there as well. Individuals do not evolve. Populations evolve over time. Okay, so that's a big deal. That is the population level is where evolution really takes place. Natural selection can only increase or decrease hereditable traits that vary in a population, and adaptations vary with different environments. Okay, so evolution is change over time, and of course historically has had a lot of controversy because it can be in opposition to people's belief systems. And why do we, well, obviously we just talked about Darwin, his travels and his observations and how he's come about what he's come about. But what are some other evidences? Because science is based upon evidence and facts that can be repeated and isolated. And it's really important in today's world to not forget that facts are important. And you know, like I said, science is real too. Facts are important, and we can't, I don't think we can afford as a gene pool of Homo sapiens to ignore a set of scientific evidences that we already know. And climate change would be one of them, and I know some people do not believe in it. But all we're doing is looking at the evidences. I just read the Antarctica, that the ice is melting so much faster than what they even expected with the global warming situation. So where's that water going to go in these oceans as all of our ice caps? We're going to lose parts of Florida. We're going to lose parts of all around the coast. But in these cities, eventually, I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen probably next year, maybe. But we're going to start seeing a creeping in of the shorelines. For we're seeing a warming in the oceans. They just said that this past year has been the warmest the ocean has been. And of course, in different areas of the ocean, the temperatures will vary. And it's affecting marine life, whether it be plant or animal, and that's affecting all the ecosystems. And everything has, this is ecology, everything has a pebble effect. You know, you throw the pebble in the water and it spreads out and one thing, the ripple effect. So what are some 4 types of data document the pattern of evolution? Direct observations, homology, the fossil record, which we've already kind of alluded to a little bit, and biogeography. Now, geography, of course, is our places on Earth, locations of places on Earth, where living things live. But biogeography is one of the big evidences of evolution. So, direct observations of evolutionary change. Natural selection in response to introduced species and the evolution of drug-resistant bacteria. And also we can add to that peppered moth, we can add to that several others. This book talks about some bugs, soapberry bugs that use their beak to feed on seeds within fruits. Feeding is most effective when beak length is closely matched to seed depth within fruit. And it talks about in southern Florida, these feed on native bloom vine with larger fruit, so they have to have longer beaks, or they won't get it. In central Florida, they feed on introduced golden rain trees with smaller fruit, and they have shorter beaks. This is sort of like the, Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. In all cases, beak sizes evolved in populations to feed on introduced plants with fruits that are smaller or larger than native fruits. And this evolution in beak size has occurred within 35 years. Again, it's an example of microevolution. And this is some of the illustrations of the textbook which show you about that. This is a biggie. Oh, you heard of MRSA? Is that something you want?
No.
No, it's not. Staphylococcus aureus, and we'll learn more about bacteria in a few chapters. But Staphylococcus aureus is a cluster-shaped, round-shaped bacterium that hangs out sort of like clusters of grapes if you look at it microscopically. That's why it's called Staphylococcus aureus. It can cause anything from boils to toxic shock syndrome. It can kill you. It can cause septicemia in the blood for other reasons, even if it's not exactly toxic shock. It's all over our skin. You've got lots of it probably around your nose. Another good reason why you shouldn't pick your nose and then eat something. So normal immune systems, most of us don't have enough of it to cause us to reach an infection situation. But sometimes when you have openings, when you've been cut, for some reason you've had a big gash on your leg or foot or something for some reason, and the typical thing is they give you antibiotics, which is pretty necessary in those situations. But unfortunately, there's a lot of Staphylococcus aureus that's become resistant to the antibiotics that we have as an arsenal. Penicillin was one of the greatest discoveries back in 1945, which Alexander Fleming actually discovered that by accident, by just the power of observation, of seeing that on his petri dish with Staphylococcus aureus as a microbiologist, that around there was a mold growing, and he was really upset with this plate because where the mold was growing, there was no bacterial growth, because that would normally give a film, filmy look of bacterial growth. And he went to throw it away, and he was pretty upset because it got contaminated by this fungi. And then he realized, oh my gosh, there's something in this mold that is inhibiting the growth of Staphylococcus aureus. And thus, the era of the penicillin, the antibiotics are substances that are produced by living things and are used to kill bacteria. Notice I did not say viruses. Antibiotics in general do not have any effect on viral infections, so only on bacterial infections. And then there's at least two different groupings of antibiotics, one that affects more gram-positive bacteria and one that affects gram-negative bacteria. But anyway, what has happened is that Staphylococcus aureus is not, there's so much of it that is totally resistant to penicillin, and there were a lot of other antibiotics. Methicillin was the next one, and evolved the Staph aureus by 1961, 2 years after it was first used. It works by inhibiting an enzyme used by bacteria to produce their cell walls. So, thus born methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, MRSA. They use different enzyme. When exposed to methicillin, MRSA strains are more likely to survive and reproduce than non-resistant Staph aureus strains. And so they're now resistant to many antibiotics, and this has happened in a matter of just a few decades, too. And in fact, there are many, we have to keep discovering stronger and stronger antibiotics to try to help people survive bad infections.
So basically, MRSA is the result of evolution.
Yes, thank you. Well said. It's a microevolution, and it continues to go on. You don't have to memorize this. Bacteria have a circular chromosome, and this is just showing you that out of close to the 3 million base pairs, nucleotides, that there are some key places where here's a locus where there's a methicillin resistance here, and there are other genes that have been adapted in order to allow them to resist treatment. So I am just going to let you look at some of these. So natural selection does not create new traits, but edits or selects for traits already present in the population. It can occur rapidly in species with short generation times. Do you know that E. coli, Escherichia coli out of the gut, is actually one of the most studied bacteria, and we use them in DNA technology as workhorses to insert genes. And under favorable conditions, E. coli reproduce by asexual reproduction, which just means binary fission or splitting, every how many minutes? 20, got it. Every 20 minutes. So you have one, 20 minutes later you have two, 20 minutes later you have four, assuming nothing's killing any of these off, of course.
It's squared.
Right. 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. And that's why when you do, when you swab environmental surfaces like cell phones, and you put them on a nutrient agar plate, that within 48 hours you have all these big colonies, which are masses and masses of bacteria that have grown with, and if it's, as long as it's surrounded by agar, like an island, they're assumed to be a pure culture, which means they all came from the same bacteria. And a colony is a result of that tremendous growth. So the current local environment determines which traits will be selected for against in any specific population. Please understand that when you take antibiotics, now let me save that for when we talk about that. That's enough of this. Okay, what's the second line of evidence? Okay, we had direct observation, and that's what these are examples of. What's the second one? The second evidence is homology. homology is similarly resulting from common ancestry. In other words, specific structures, like anatomy, specific structures coming from common ancestors, but may have different functions. Similarity in bone structures, for instance. Here you go. Here you go. Look at this. These are all mammals. Here's us. Here's our funny bone. Humorous. Okay. And if you look at the similar bones, look at the cat, that they walk a little different, but you see homology. You see how the bone structure, like this big bone though in a whale, is up here, but look at these long phalanges, fingertips, to be able to swim. And then the bat to be able to fly. But they have similar bone structure, similar origin. Homology. Comparative embryology, which means if you compare embryos of these, all vertebrate embryos have a post-anal tail and pharyngeal arches. Here's a chick embryo, and at a similar respective points in their development, embryological development, all vertebrates have had gill slits, which are those pharyngeal arches, and they've had a tail, including us. So if you also lined up a fish, and you lined up a reptile, and an amphibian, and a bird, and the embryo stages, they're all very similar, and it's very hard to tell which one's which, unless you thoroughly study. We all tend to retrace the same steps as our grouping of evolution. There's a phrase for that. I know you want it. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny.
It's English.
It's actually Latin, pretty much.
The anatomy reflects physical.
The retracing of the steps of the group. Yes. So ontogeny, the individual development, retraces the steps of the phylum, or the phyla, the groupings, and like the vertebrates. Also, vestigial structures are remnants of features that serve to function in the organism's ancestors. Examples of homologies at the molecular level are genes shared among organisms inherited from a common ancestor. So vestigial, they're no longer used, but they're remains from common ancestry. Yes?
So would this be like when they take out gallbladders because they don't think it really is part of our body?
We can live without it, and we do. We may not. We may have more episodes with eating fatty foods. But the appendix, for instance, I used to think was a vestigial organ, but we don't say that any longer because we now know it's a part of the immune system. And even though it's kind of a shriveled up little piece left over from herbivores, plant eaters, like cows.
Back when we used to eat plants, we used to have a longer intestinal tract.
Right, right, you got it. So, and then the evolutionary trees or diagrams to reflect the hypotheses about the relationships. The thing of it is that we used to make these truly by taxonomy of comparing outward characteristics, but now a lot of it is also comparing DNA, which gets it much more specific. So you see different branch points here where digit-bearing limbs. This is the amnion. The amnion is the amniotic egg, which it was a big deal. We'll talk more about this in the zoology part. It's a big deal of animals that live in water or were tied to water to reproduce. The reptiles were the first group to be able to lay an egg on land and not dry out and have an amnion, which is an amniotic sac. Of course, we have an amniotic sac when women are pregnant, and there's an amniotic sac around it too. So that development of the amnion allowed for terrestrial, land-dwelling organisms. And the development down here on feathers, so homologous characteristics. There is a different cause of resemblance. Convergent evolution is an evolution of similar or analogous features in distantly related groups. The arising groups independently adapt to similar environments in similar ways. Birds and bats. Birds are different. They're actually glorified reptiles with feathers that can fly, okay? But bats are mammals, and they have mammary glands and all that, but their ability to fly, they have some characteristics that have developed similarly, but they're not really that related. So that's convergent evolution, coming together and having traits of the opposite of homologous, which are called analogous, which are different structures of origin but similar functions. And the sugar gliders that are examples. The fossil record. These are still evidences of, okay, here we go. Homology of fossil remains. We look at the different ankle bones in this case, of the dog, and here's the pig, and here's a deer, not the ankle bones and the ungulates. Fossils can document important positions like from land to sea, the ancestors of the whales and the manatees and so forth. In your book, it's got some possible. I've already mentioned that to you before. Also, biogeography is a scientific study of geographic distribution of species, provides evidence of evolution. At one time, all the continents of the world were one land mass, and that was called Pangaea. And then within several million years, it started, you've heard of continental drift? They drifted apart. But if you look at the world and you look at South America and you look at Africa and you look at North America, they fit. And then the islands of Australia and all of those. So we know that when it was Pangaea, that all of these organisms probably were able to live in the same place. Endemic species are species that are not found anywhere else in the world, and islands are typically endemic because they become isolated. And this next chapter is going to get more into what isolation of a population gets into. So let's stop here. That pretty much is that chapter, but I really urge you to look at that 4-column outline I've given you and highlight the categories and what's under what and how things fit together. And then also start studying C23 as well.